Welcome back to Just Liberty, my friends, where liberty and justice meet. I'm Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, with my co-host Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine. And we're having fun doing this program. And I hope that we're not just maybe a little entertaining, but informative as well. Now, this next guest we're going to be interviewing, I'm really excited about this because for many, many years within the religious freedom community, we've wondered about how it is that of all the Western countries, the United States still has a vigorous Christian, community, and we are still essentially, a Christian country socially, culturally, in many ways. And, you know, we're calling Europe post-Christian. What made the difference? How is it that Europe is post-Christian, but we are not? And we have a scholar from Regent University who has been looking into the relationship between church and state and the influence it has on religious affiliation, well, I'll let him speak. Bettina, go ahead and interview our guest. Well, our guest today is Professor Dan Koev, chair of the Government and Criminal Justice Department at Regent University in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And Dan has taken upon himself to research a really interesting topic that some of us have been thinking about, but for many years, but we've never had actual research, which is, what kind of impact do we see from government embrace of religion or religious nationalism? What impact does it have on religion itself? So, Dan, welcome to Just Liberty.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, first off, what led you to want to study this topic in the first place?
Yeah, so part of it is actually autobiographical. So I grew up in Bulgaria, which is a very Orthodox country, but I was raised in a Protestant Pentecostal home. Very small minority of the population in Bulgaria, and sometimes viewed somewhat skeptically by the mainstream of Bulgarian society because of its religious distinctives. And so I always had this idea about dynamics between minority and majority religions. But also when I was age 12, I had the opportunity to come to the United States, emigrating with my parents. And then I was able to contrast Bulgaria and the United States. The United States, formally not a Christian country, and yet it seemed much more Christian as far as the impact of Christianity on society, on individual lives, than a more formally Christian country like Bulgaria. So I think that got my gears turning about, well, why is it that we have formal Christianity over here, but it's not translating to a living faith? In the United States, it seems to be the other way around. But I think the more immediate reason I was drawn to this topic is that a few years ago, there was this growing discourse about Christian nationalism. And you had some pretty extreme views on the left and on the right. On the left, there was the sense that it's going to take us back to the Dark Ages, and on the right, it's going to take us to the Promised Land. But all of the discussions seem to focus on the impact of religion on government. Very little of it seemed to be the other way around. So what is the impact of government favoritism on religions, both the ones that are favored by the state and the ones that are not favored by the state? And that is what I wanted to study in this article.
So Dan, how did you even begin to approach this? Because it sounds to me like a very ambitious research project, huge, I mean, global in scale. How did you approach it initially? How did you walk us through the framework that you decided to use to collect your data?
Sure. Well, I do quantitative social science research. That was what I was trained to do in my PhD program. So I kind of defaulted to that. It's a very big world out there, and to do like a proper qualitative analysis of religion in like 170 countries just seemed impractical. But I came across some pretty useful data sources. The key to it was actually the religious characteristics of states data set compiled by Davis Brown, with whom I had personal communication. So it was the access to that data, which tracks changes in religious affiliation in something like 170 countries for a very long period of time. That really allowed me to study the question quantitatively.
So did you focus broadly on 170 countries, or were you selective?
So I believe in the article, I ended up using 168, which is most of the sovereign nation states existing in the world.
And so what specifically were you looking at? What measuring sticks were you considering?
So the primary dependent variable in the analysis was religious affiliation. And I broke that down into those affiliating with the majority religion of the state versus those affiliating with all minority religions in the state. Ideally, I would love to use other measures of religiosity. It would be great to get data on religious beliefs, how strongly they're held, on religious attendance. But to do that for 168 countries just was not practical. We have the World Values Survey, but it's not carried out every year, and not in all countries. So I limited it to specifically to affiliation.
So give us then a nutshell. What were your findings? What did you discover?
Yeah. So what I found is that on average, when the largest religion in a country received state favoritism, it tended to lose adherence over time. Fewer and fewer people in that country tended to affiliate with that favored religion. In contrast, minority religions tended to see growth. So more and more people over time tended to affiliate themselves with the minority religion if the majority religion was favored by the state. So it's a very counterintuitive finding, because the very purpose of these types of church-state policies is that it's meant to kind of bolster and support and strengthen the national religion. But what I found is actually quite the opposite dynamic was in play. And this wasn't just a bivariate relationship, but even after controlling for a host of other variables, it still held up, and it was statistically significant.
So what were some of the variables that you thought you needed to try to control for?
So I controlled for immigration, for example, because that's something that can contribute to growing religious diversity. Some countries might have a growing minority religious population just because you have migrants from Middle East, North Africa. But other kind of standard variables like economic development, that can impact religiosity. Even something like the political regime, whether it was a democracy, broad kind of respect for civil liberties. These are some of the things I control for.
Okay, so can you surmise, I guess, why government support backfires? I mean, are there specific factors that you can point to, or maybe that seem like they would cause this kind of counterintuitive effect?
Sure. Well, here I'm reliant on the work of Rodney Stark and Roger Finke, and because just kind of the broad religious market theory. But basically what they catalog in their book Acts of Faith is some of the deficiencies that state support seems to create. And the cases that they look at primarily are the Scandinavian Lutheran established churches. And they point out, for example, that state favoritism makes clergy complacent because they're not open to competitive pressures. They don't have to go out and evangelize and win new converts. All that actually means is that it creates more work for them. You have, like a bigger flock. They need more need for pastoral care. And in fact, clergy in those countries are basically unionized civil servants. So they have job security, and really it's in their incentive not to have very large and vibrant congregations. But they also point out that the state support tends to lead to a lazy laity as well, because it creates the sense that government is a state provided service, and it seems to kind of cheapen religion. It's something, well, the government's taking my tax money and it's supporting religion, so why should I donate? Why should I volunteer? It kind of seems to discourage and cheapen religious fervor. And then also doctrinal meddling. When you have these church-state linkages, government often feels like it has a vested interest in controlling the teaching and practices of the church. And sometimes in the Scandinavian cases, it did make changes that were contrary to what the majority of clergy wanted and what the average layperson wanted. I would say additionally, in authoritarian states like an Islamic theocracy like Iran, what happens is that clergy become linked to the regime, so they're seen as an extension of a corrupt authoritarian regime. And what that tends to encourage is more of a private expression of religion rather than public participation, like going to religious services. So
Dan, I think your level of scholarship is very different than someone like James Madison, who, as really in his late teens and early 20s, was doing a deep dive in history. But in the one document that I recommend to Americans in terms of, reading where kind of the foundations of American religious freedom is Memorial and Remonstrance. And his summary, I think, is just kind of parallels what you're saying. He wrote in that document, a couple hundred years ago, during almost 15 centuries, has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial? What have been its fruits? And his conclusion, more or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. So that was, Madison's assessment of, history, Christian history from the time of Constantine to his own time. And it sounds like, your modern analysis pretty much tracks with his survey of history.
Yeah, I suppose so. I think that's a great point of comparison.
So give us the flip side then. If state support for religion equates with these sort of outcomes, what does a more hands-off approach tend to encourage? Like the United States tradition of church-state separation, for instance, how has that impacted the religious marketplace, I guess, here in the United States?
Sure. Well, it means that every religious institution, every church, every denomination has to fend for itself. It's exposed to those competitive pressures. And so it has to offer something of meaning and value to its flock. And that could mean providing certain social services. It could mean providing effective pastoral care. Often it means just providing a very compelling teaching that is transformative, that can be a kind of guiding light for a group of people, and creating a really strong sense of community and commitment. And so long as you have religious institutions exposed to competition, you're going to have more vibrant religion overall.
So, Dan, listening to you describe all of this, it seems to me that what you've discovered, your research, has some pertinence to some of the debates that are taking place today in America, as in what is the proper role for religion, for Christianity in our country. And it seems to me that, it's a really hard line to define, because on one hand, some people perceive church-state separation as hostility toward religion. And I guess there are times when it sort of veers over to that side. Would that be correct?
Yeah, so I think this requires a very nuanced approach. I was very careful in my article not to say that we shouldn't have any sort of um, reflection of Christian values or recognition of Christianity's historical role in the development of the United States. It's certainly something that I incorporate into my classes, is to make the argument that Christianity not only contributed to the emergence of American politics and society, but to all of Western civilization. All of the Christian world was impacted by biblical teaching. And I don't think we should shy away from that and so some sort of public recognition of that. I think my problem is when government decides that it's going to pick winners and losers in the religious economy. And when it says, well, this denomination will get these benefits, or even we're going to favor specifically Christian churches, but we're going to exclude Jews and we're going to exclude Muslims, because I think that creates a sense of second-class citizenship on the part of those minority faiths, just as I, to some extent, felt growing up as a Pentecostal Protestant in Bulgaria. And that is a kind of unpleasant feeling. You don't feel like you're fully part of society or like you're fully part of the state. So I just think we need to take great care and great caution. There are some examples where I think the state has effectively supported a church, but those also tend to be very homogenous societies. They are not religiously and ethnically pluralistic in the way that the United States is. So some of the success cases that are discussed in the literature are places like Turkey, which is like 99% Muslim. Yes, there Erdogan has supported Islamic education and he supported Islamic cultural institutions. And that does seem to have had some effect in kind of increasing kind of religious fervor in Turkey. Similar story in Romania, with the Romanian state helping to build new Orthodox churches. That does seem to have had an effect in raising religious attendance in Romania. But again, that's 85% Orthodox country. If you don't have this kind of unity, I think it's really tricky to get that balance right between government favoritism toward religion without kind of encroaching on the rights of minorities.
So, I wanted to go back to the United States as an example of a country that has had a greater degree of Christian commitment than other Western countries, but less government support for religion than, say England, where there's considerable financial support for the churches and clergy salaries and that sort of thing, or Germany. Are there other examples of nations that have had more of a hands-off approach where religious commitment has been stronger as a result?
That's a great question. I think actually if we look at some of the most devoutly Christian countries in the world today, we find that they are in parts of the world characterized by religious liberty. So sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, these are regions which lead the world in religious affiliation, in religious attendance, in religious beliefs. And what you also find is that on measures of religious liberty and impartiality of the state toward religion, they're also some of the highest scoring states. So I don't think it's just a story about the United States. Of course, you can also find cases where you have a secular state, and we've had tremendous secularization, particularly in France's much more aggressive separation of church and state, which basically banishes religion from the public square, especially since 1905. I don't mean to suggest that anytime you have a formally secular state that embraces pluralism, it's going to be a recipe for this vibrant religious life. I think it probably helps, but it certainly does not guarantee it.
And yet, in a country like China, I think part of our sort of axiomatic belief is that genuine religious experience thrives under adversity, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in nations like China, where religion is completely dominated by the state, and there's a vibrant home church movement. Christianity has had explosive growth under very, very harsh circumstances.
That's a great point. And that's actually a question that I explore in a book that I'm currently working on. I just actually submitted the manuscript to Oxford University Press. But one of the chapters in the book deals with precisely that question of, does religion thrive under oppression, under persecution? And what I found is that it can, but under limited oppression and persecution. And often what we tend to find is that when severe oppression is relaxed, then the church begins to grow. And that is actually what we observe in China since 1979. Under Mao, there was incredible persecution of religion under the Cultural Revolution. But since the reins over society and religion were somewhat loosened, again, I'm not trying to minimize the hardships that Christians face, that Muslims face in China, but there's a lot of regional diversity within China as far as how the provincial authorities enforce the anti-religious edicts of the Chinese Communist Party, that they allow a certain amount of free reign in some parts of the country. And I found really strong evidence that once those rules governing religion were relaxed in China, that's when you begin to see the growth of Christianity. And not just in the Chinese case, but many other cases. You see the same thing in Poland in the 1960s, Yugoslavia in the 1960s as well. So a lot of these communist countries had a period where they kind of relaxed persecution, and then growth tended to follow. I think, unfortunately, in cases where we have really extreme forms of persecution, those are usually effective. Like North Korea, for example, far less. It used to be more Christian than South Korea, and now it's the other way around. East Germany, that was a very effectively secularized country by the communist government there.
This may be well outside your area of research, but I'm interested in this global rise in religious populism and the linking of religious identity with national identity that we're seeing not just in the United States, but in places like India, where being a Hindu is akin to your identity, your national identity. If you're not a Hindu, then you're not a true Indian. If you're Muslim, if you're Christian, you're outside that sort of national identity. And in many Muslim majority countries, you have that same sense of your religion is your national identity. Did your research touch on this at all?
My research doesn't necessarily touch on that, but it is part of what motivated me to study the question in the first place, because going back to my upbringing in Bulgaria, I always had this sense that a lot of Orthodox Christianity in Bulgaria was basically cultural Christianity, that people tended not to go to church. It didn't seem like they prayed or read the Bible, or it had much of an impact on their lives. A small minority of them did, who identified as Orthodox, but many of them seem to see it as a kind of cultural expression or as a form of patriotism. And I think a lot of Americans tend to miss that when we kind of look at arguments about, well, Russia is standing for Christian civilization, or Viktor Orban in Hungary is standing for Christian civilization. I think people aren't aware that these are actually some of the most secularized countries in the world. Like, their religious attendance is like in the single digits compared to much higher in the United States. And so often there's this big disconnect between how they present themselves and what the reality is of their religious demographics.
But I don't know how to make a question out of this, but I get a sense that for many Americans, Christianity is the same as what you just described in Russia and with Viktor Orban, where it's a form of identity and patriotism far more than it is an experience of faith.
No, I think that's fair. I think you find that sort of cultural Christianity in countries throughout the world. I would say that there's just a variation in the proportion. Because I certainly remember, and unfortunately, I think the United States has started to secularize starting around the year 2005. But certainly coming to the United States, it was the difference was very palpable. Like there was a church in every neighborhood, often multiple churches, and they were actually full. They were full of people, which, I go back to Bulgaria and I visit the St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Sofia, this incredibly gorgeous place of worship, wonderful experience, and yet it's mostly empty. And, half the people there are tourists. So I actually think it definitely is an element of American Christianity, but it's not as pronounced as it is in most other countries.
Right.
So Dan, your experience actually echoes mine to a certain extent, because I came to the United States from Australia about 30 years ago. And I remember distinctly my shock at coming to America and going to a restaurant and seeing families pause before eating to say grace over their food, to bless their food. And that is just something that doesn't happen in secular Australia. I mean, it would be perceived as entirely outside the cultural norm to do that in a very obvious way. It's fascinating to see two Western countries, both from a Christian heritage, both have a Western Christian legal tradition, and yet the level of their expression in contemporary society is so very, very different.
Absolutely.
Alan, I think this has been a fascinating interview, and it's one I think that has raised more questions even than we've had time to address. If people are interested in reading Professor Koev's article in Liberty Magazine, I'd encourage them to go to libertymagazine.org. It is an insightful, thought-provoking article that I'm delighted that we were able to publish in Liberty. Thank you so much, Professor, for your time today and for your research. We wish you all the best with your book as well.
Thank you so much.
Amen. And it strikes me that there needs to be more of this sort of cross-cultural analysis of church-state relations, because I think where we're all in agreement is the desire for a flourishing Christian faith, and how the government's embrace either may help or hinder that is a very important topic.
Well, thank you. I hope that my current work will contribute something meaningful to that, to those questions.
Amen. Well, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
So that was a fascinating conversation, Alan, and I'm looking forward to his book. He mentioned that he's just finished writing a book on his research, and I think that's going to be really instructive for us as people who talk about this issue all the time. What really are the tangible, concrete, measurable outcomes of government support for religion?
And Bettina, it's so easy for, the conservative religious movement to criticize and dismiss those of us who advocate for church-state separation as somehow being atheist or hostile to religion, right? And, what we insist on is we're separationists precisely because of our deep, deep religious commitment. We want the church to thrive. We want the gospel to go to all the world for a witness. So, Christ, we believe in Christ's visible, return, and that the gospel must go to the world. And we want the church to be the church and to be effective. And we see all of this politics as kind of another distraction, right? It's like, I don't know what church you're involved in. Churches get into the devil distracts us so easily, doesn't he? Fights over music, fights over, the color of the carpet and the church renovation, all kinds of things, whether women should serve as elders or pastors. There's no end of things that we like to get distracted and fight over, instead of simply learning how to live by faith and to be a witness for our Lord and Savior. But we want the church to be the church, and it's so frustrating
Yeah. So
to see this dynamic.
church-state separation is freedom for religion, not freedom from religion. But the tricky thing, Alan, is that, you know as well as I do, that especially in the last decade or so, church-state separation has actually been used by folk who are hostile to religious expression. And that's what makes this such a difficult argument to make sometimes, because you see clear examples of advocates who are coming into the public space and saying, religion should not receive any exemptions from neutral, generally applicable laws. Religion should not be given any sort of special treatment in law, and they do it from a place of hostility toward religion. And so when we come in, Alan, and we're saying church-state separation is good for religion, it becomes a much harder sell.
You're taking me back, Bettina. Years ago, Jerry Falwell and Barry Lynn, from a religious conservative organization and an organization that was hostile to the Christian right, they were strange bedfellows, if you will, because you would see them on TV news shows and interview shows and what have you. They were the talking heads that would be battling one another and then sending out fundraising letters to raise money to fight the other guy, because the right needs a hostile left to raise money, and the hostile left needs the religious right to, have a reason to exist. And I would describe it as a sick symbiotic relationship between, these two elements. And yet those of us, from the Adventist community, from the Baptist community, who are historically, from the Jewish community, who are historic American separationists, we're not the secular left. We're not hostile to religion, but neither are we on the sort of political bandwagon of the religious right. We're advocating for religious freedom for everybody. And it's a tough spot to be in.
It's kind of uncomfortable, Alan. I often describe it as the ground is shrinking underneath our feet.
And my phrase is the lonely middle.
The lonely middle. I like that too. But it is absolutely true in this environment that, it's becoming harder and harder to position yourself as a defender of church-state separation in a way that doesn't raise people's suspicion that you're trying to be hostile toward religion. And I think that's why the interview that we did today is so important, because it shows that fundamentally having those separate spheres for the civil and for the religious institutions in society, it aids religion. It in the end, it makes it stronger. It helps it thrive in a way that state support does not.
Yes, indeed. Well, the embrace of the state, the bear hug, may not be healthy for the church.
Indeed. And on that note, let's wrap up this episode, Alan. And until next time, thank you so much for listening. I'm Bettina Krause with my co-host, Alan Reineck. And remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So be informed, get involved.